Rhodesia didn't lose the war because its soldiers were weak. They lost because they didn't even understand the war they were fighting. They fought harder, smarter, and deadlier than almost any army of their time, crushing their enemies on the battlefield. But in the end, the guerrillas won. Why? Because this was never really a military war. At its peak, the Rhodesian light infantry fielded just 10,000 men. Facing them were nearly 100,000 Soviet-trained guerrillas backed by Cuba and spread across Africa, outnumbering the Rhodesians 10-1. And yet, the RLI's kill ratio was staggering, up to 50 guerrillas for every Rhodesian lost. On the battlefield, it was the communists who were losing and losing badly. Some Rhodesian victories were so lopsided they defy belief. Take Operation Eland. Just 84 Selous scouts stormed a camp of 5,000 ZANU guerrillas. The outcome? Over 1,000 guerrillas killed without a single Rhodesian casualty. In the end, Rhodesia became Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe took power, and what followed were some of the worst human rights atrocities seen since World War II. If this had been a conventional war fought in Europe between European armies, the Rhodesians would almost certainly have won. On the battlefield, they crushed their enemies again and again and again. But that wasn't enough, because this war wasn't fought on a single front, it was fought on three. And the Rhodesians only understood and even fought it in one: conventional warfare. The second front was propaganda, and here the communists had the upper hand. They sold a simple story to the world. Rhodesia was nothing more than stolen land occupied by a tiny white minority who owed a permanent debt to the original so-called inhabitants. Never mind that 4 centuries before, the land had been locked in cycles of tribal warfare, famine, and subsistence farming. Never mind that in 1 generation it had been transformed into a nation of modern farms, thriving industries, and some of the best living standards in Africa for black people specifically. To the propaganda machine, none of that mattered. Rhodesians were painted as villains, and the global press carried the message. Sanctions followed, isolation followed, and pressure mounted until Rhodesia was strangled, not by guns but by words alone. The pen truly was mightier than the sword. The third front is one seldom spoken about: demographics. Before Europeans arrived, life in what became Rhodesia was short and brutal. High infant mortality, disease, hunger, and constant brutal killings and bloody fighting between the Matabele and Shona peoples. Most people died before reaching adulthood, and those who did died young in war. The tribes adapted by having as many children as possible, knowing that only a few would survive. But when Europeans brought peace between the tribes, or actually forced peace between the tribes, modern medicine and agriculture that could feed millions, the old strategy didn't change. The local populace kept having as many children as possible, but now nearly all of them survived. The result was a population explosion on a scale that Rhodesians could never have prepared for. Add to that the flood of migrants pouring in from neighboring countries to share in Rhodesia's prosperity and wealth, and the demographic tide became unstoppable for Rhodesians. The truth is that Rhodesia never lost the war on the battlefield. They lost it in the newspapers, in the halls of the United Nations, and in the sheer mathematics of the population. And once those forces aligned, no amount of military brilliance could have ever saved them. During the 90s, Rhodesia held a number of demographic surveys which estimated the population number, but the first full census results would only be published in 1970, 5 years after the country became independent. And what was revealed stunned the nation. The black African population increased to a whopping 4.8 million, while white Rhodesians numbered only 228,000, or just under 5% of the population. Even the Rhodesians who lived in the white neighborhoods of Salisbury and other predominantly white areas in the country were shocked at how demographically overwhelmed the Anglo-Rhodesians had become. It was hard to believe that less than a century earlier, the likes of Jan Smuts and Cecil John Rhodes envisaged the establishment of a federal United States of Southern Africa, also known as Greater South Africa, which would have spanned all the way up to the Congo and could have maintained its Western cultural identity through mass immigration from Europe and specifically Britain and the Netherlands. But in the 20th century, as Europeans brought better healthcare and increased living standards to Southern Africa in particular, the black population exploded. Not only did far more children survive infancy, but masses of Africans from the north migrated into white-ruled South Africa and Rhodesia in search of a better life than they could have under their own governments. But how did it happen that the Rhodesians of the 20th century seemingly simply allowed themselves to be completely swamped and overrun by people from all these other countries? Looking back, one could really ask how on earth did they not see this coming? Well, apart from the fact that census figures weren't as readily available in the day, one can attribute this to the naivety of the white Rhodesians who lived prior to the end of the Second World War and the establishment of the United Nations in 1945. The fact of the matter is that they all grew up in a different world, an era that preceded global democratization and so-called decolonization of the Third World. As hard as it is for us in the 21st century to believe, they lived in a world where taking care of the vulnerable counted way more weight than equal rights written down on a piece of paper or constitution. The old Rhodesians simply believed that the black African in their country would always be content and always be grateful for the advances that the Europeans brought to this continent, which had drastically improved everyone's lives immeasurably. But things changed after the Second World War, as a new global political order was initiated that also had tremendous repercussions for Africa. And so by 1970, with the release of the census data, Ian Smith's government finally started to realize the extent of the demographic disaster that had already hit the country by that time. They proceeded to explore a number of measures to try and stem the demographic tide, including advertising campaigns to South Africa, Britain, and continental Europe to attract skilled white workers, as well as subsidized travel and settlement assistance for white immigrants, particularly from places like Portugal and Poland, after decolonization in Mozambique and Angola. Furthermore, Rhodesia actively courted immigrating whites from collapsing colonies such as Angola after 1974. By the way, if you find our work informative, receive free updates from us on WhatsApp. Just follow these steps on the banner right here. Yet by this time the demographic writing was already on the wall, and to exacerbate the problem, Ian Smith's government never really advanced beyond a few half measures. In part because of white Rhodesians' reliance upon black labor, and in part because of a fear of a backlash from the black population if restrictions on movement and immigration were implemented. Any reforms that would have actually succeeded in making a difference were shot down in Rhodesian Parliament. And so, throughout the 1970s, the situation simply continued to get worse. White birth rates declined fast. By this time, the white birth rate was only slightly above replacement rate, while black women had 3 times more children than white women, averaging around 6 to 7 children per woman. The Rhodesian government was unable to incite white families to have more children, while the family planning measures they tried to propagate among the black population failed to have the desired effect. And so, by the 1976 census, it was crystal clear that the writing was already on the wall. White Rhodesians now counted 270,000, but were heavily outnumbered by nearly 6 million black Africans. The Rhodesians could no longer maintain political control over a country that was inhabited by other nations. And in 1980, Rhodesia was transformed into Zimbabwe, as ZANU-PF took control of the country, with Robert Mugabe consequently being sworn in as Prime Minister. At the end of the day, the Rhodesians did not lose their country because they were incapable of beating Zanla and ZAPU on the battlefields. They lost because the population of their country were radically transformed in a few short decades. They lost not because they didn't have the necessary firepower, they lost because the babies being born in Rhodesian hospitals were black Africans and not Anglo-Rhodesians. They lost because the people crossing the Rhodesian borders mostly came from Malawi and Mozambique rather than Great Britain or Ireland. They lost because the war they were fighting was the same war being fought by every single European nation in the world today, the war of demographics. Do you like our content? Make this channel stronger by becoming a member of the Willem Petzer group. Just follow these little steps on the banner right here. The fall of Rhodesia was not just a tragedy. For one small settler nation in Africa, it was a warning to the entire Western world. It showed that no amount of military brilliance, no amount of economic strength, and no amount of political maneuvering can save a people who refuse to face the most fundamental reality of all time. Demographics decide destiny. For Rhodesia, the numbers were merciless. A white community of fewer than 300,000 was never going to hold political control in a democracy over millions of Africans forever. The moment the propaganda war and the United Nations shifted the rules to one man, one vote, the outcome was already predetermined. Once the demographic scale tipped so heavily, Rhodesians were no longer masters of their own future or of the country that they had built themselves. They were passengers on someone else's train. This is the great consequence, not just for Rhodesia, but a lesson for every Western nation today. If a people do not protect their borders, if they do not ensure that their children will inherit the land of their fathers, then no constitution and no army and no tradition will ever save them. Rhodesia teaches us that when demographics shift, everything else shifts with it: power, culture, and the very survival of a nation. Rhodesia matters because of what is unfolding in Europe, in South Africa, and across the Western world. Borders are open, birth rates are collapsing, and people are being replaced with those who do not share any ancestry with them. If we refuse to learn from Rhodesia, then we are doomed to become Zimbabwe. We are all Rhodesians now in a war for global Zimbabwe. As the Willem Petzer Group recently pointed out in a video about the decline in the city of Cape Town, which you can view by clicking on this link right here, demographic trends truly shape socio-political destiny. So don't just watch this, share the message and speak the truth. The pen can still be mightier than the sword. The survival of Western nations depend on the truth being shared. Remember to become a member of the Willem Petzer Group to help us produce this content by just following these little steps on the banner right here. Goodbye and God bless.